Oh, okay. There we go. All right. Chris Fritton is a poet, printer, and artist based in Buffalo, New York. He's the former studio director of the Western New York Book Arts Center, and he's best known for his decade-long traveling project and subsequent book, The Itinerant Printer. He's been a visiting artist and instructor at hundreds of institutions, including RISD, MICA, VCU, the Center for Book Arts, and others. His work is held at the Library of Congress, the Ruth and Marvin Sackner Archive of Concrete and Visual Poetry at the University of Iowa, the Letter from Archive, and more. Keri Miki-Lani Schroeder is a book artist and proprietor of Coyote Bones Press based in San Antonio, Texas. She creates limited edition artist books, teaches workshops at various institutions, and hosts Books in the Wild podcast. Keri holds an MFA in book art and creative writing from Mills College and has worked at Flying Fish Press and Book Lab 2 as an edition bookbinder. She was awarded as Helen M. Salzberg Artist in Residence for the Jaffe Center for Book Arts in 2019-2020, winner of the 2022 MCBA Prize, and recipient of the 2023 Center for Craft Teaching Artist Cohort Grant. Okay, and I will now turn it over to Keri and Chris.
Thank you, Annika.
Thanks.
Happy. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm excited to talk about this project. All right. So thank you for that introduction. We're going to talk about our collaboration, Please Stay Until Doomsday. And most of my projects begin with a title. So I think ideas come to me in this very formless, misty cloud shape, but it's really once the title is decided on that's when everything can kind of form around it. So with Doomsday, I was actually playing with this title for a few years. I had written it in different sketchbooks. I even made a model, I think in like 2019, 2020. But it was called Come Stay Until Doomsday. There was other iterations where it's like, Come Stay With Me Until Doomsday. There's a little model with the foil on the dark blue from that time period too. And it was just something I was toying with. I didn't have a real firm idea of where it was going. Nothing had quite gelled just yet. But early last year, I met Chris Fritton. And I think one thing that we do have in common is we're not much for small talk. So even in the very first conversation, it was about this epidemic of loneliness, and followed by multiple conversations about, we're technically more connected than ever before, with the potential of near instantaneous communication, and yet people are more isolated and lonely, and interpersonal relationships seem to be suffering kind of across the board, which is just really, just regular getting to know you kind of talk, I think. But we're talking about projects, and throughout these conversations, one of them I brought up was Come Stay Until Doomsday. And I knew that it needed to be about these ideas, about loneliness and connection and relationships. And as I was talking it through, Chris made the suggestion if I wanted to change the title to just Please Stay Until Doomsday, which was such a profound but very simple change. And that was the title. It was the correct title. And then from there, it really became apparent of what the book needed to be. And I asked Chris to write the text for the book, because if the whole book is about connection and vulnerability, it made sense for it to be a collaboration in that way.
I think it's important to note that shift to me was meaningful because when we're talking about loneliness, the come stay until doomsday felt a little more like an invitation, but the please stay until doomsday felt a little more desperate in a certain way. And it was more emotionally charged. One felt very neutral, and then the other one felt a little bit erratic, as well as desperate. And I thought that put like a different kind of energy behind it. So that's where that kind of came from. That was the original notion behind it.
Um, it also sounds, and it's less of a command and more of a, like you said, like a pleading or asking. It's more polite
Yeah,
too.
it's true.
So when we were deciding on a structure, it was always going to be a volvelle. I don't think any other structure was considered. So volvelles or wheel charts, they're originally used as astronomical charts. So they hide and reveal information depending on how you interact with the structure. So a little bit of data will be revealed at different points in a different or in a sequence, a set sequence. These are just some examples of volvelle charts. So we have the nuclear bomb effects, like the blast radius chart, which is pretty intense. Along which is a horoscope wheel. You'll see it a lot in star charts and navigational charts and these, calculators in a way. So I looked at all these different examples and collected them to try to come up with a structure in mind and how to layer that information and what would be revealed at different points. I know that we wanted to mimic a traditional astronomical chart, but the maps would be used for internal, like personal navigation rather than like through physical space. But we were really constructing a system to kind of navigate and categorize human experiences. So these were some of the inspiration pictures that were collected to make those. I especially love the little
I think once
diagram.
we get that kind of like format, then our first thought was both to go for these historical examples and kind of see what we could build, on a previous infrastructure. And out of it, I think came a certain number of shapes as well as maybe ancillary designs too.
These were the first, or this is the first sketch of Doomsday. So the shape and the design stayed pretty consistent throughout. We also developed this word list of to kind of shape and bring together what we were both doing on the project. And also to not repeat words or not to just to see, I guess, build a skeleton of what we're building upon.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like you said, you start from a title, and all of my book projects have started from titles as well. But then I like to craft a vernacular for it. So a series of words that are going to be words throughout. So as we kind of built that out, it gave me the skeleton, but it also gave me very specific, I think, terms that I knew were going to be used. I could kind of excise others and focus in on certain ones. So the word list was really helpful in terms of crafting a tone for the whole project.
These were images used for the color inspiration. And this is another thing that didn't change throughout the whole project. These were images, telescope images from the James Webb telescope. And then in the middle is a constellation chart. So I liked this grid pattern, and that'll show up, or that does show up in the book itself.
And those are nebulas. So we kind of noticed that even though we understand those are colorized representations of those spaces, that that could be something to lean into because we have this kind of atmospheric, really colorful notion of these spatial phenomena. And I think that we both were like, it needs to be bright, but also subtle. So the pinks and the mauves and the kind of blues really became a feature of the book later on.
When, excuse me, when I was illustrating the book, these were some of the images I had in mind. So these are images from a clairvoyant named Annie Besant, and these are her thought form paintings. And I loved this idea so much that we tried to, or we compiled a list of, different human experiences and things that would be fixed on this chart that wouldn't be part of the movable structure itself. So illustrating things like limerence and just these different experiences and emotions. And it was really inspired by Annie Besant because she was a theosophist and a painter and clairvoyant. And so she would paint these things of pure emotion. And I like the idea that she's calling them, or that it's because of her, psychic abilities that she can paint these, and they're not just imagination. The pink figure on the top is called vague pure affection. And the one underneath it is vague selfish affection. And so she's illustrating these, and I like the idea that she's like, oh, no, 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 like I'm not imagining these. Like I just have the psychic ability to actually see what all of these things are. And I I like that. I like that. I also the idea of just bringing things down to these core symbols. These are more figures from different planispheric charts when we were collecting historical images to reference from, and examples of the typography we were looking at too.
We knew it needed to be something with a historical reference, but we hoped that it had a more kind of modern flavor. So I think looking at those old typographical references was also something that felt kind of key when it came to the design components that were going to end up being a part of the final project.
These were sketches of as we started getting closer and closer to building an actual model. Again, not a lot changed. It just kind of got added to the whole project itself. It moved pretty quick. This was the first model that we made. We decided on these to have as much content as possible in a small space, and where there could be multiple configurations. And so we have this layered volvelle. And if I go to the next slide, there's a video of it, how it works. So we could have an interchangeable poem.
So there's a series of 4 concentric volvelles, and there's 5 lines on each. And that's as you rotate those, you can orient, say, the first one on the first volvelle with the second one on the second volvelle, or any number of different configurations or permutations of that. So this was kind of how we got essentially the most bang for our buck, was creating that much surface area that would be visible at the same time. But it also created a lot of problems. In this model, you can see during the video that you can see text that's visible, like underneath where the knobs would be. So that was one of the early problems that we had to resolve in terms of design aspects corresponding with content.
Whoops. This was a little bit more refined. The one on the right, we decided to get rid of the 2 volvelles on the bottom because there was just too much going on. So when we're designing it, we're designing all of the content, all of the design, the actual, like the mechanics of it and how it works along with the text concurrently. And it was a lot because we have to design everything at once, but then also the different layers that it'll be seen and how it'll be interacted with. This is the same.
I think at this point, materials became a big concern because as we discovered, a lot of papers weren't up to the task and they wouldn't really provide what we needed. So we ended up having to go with thicker boards or other things that would do the job. And the volvelles themselves had to be essentially nested within one another so that we could get the results that we wanted. Again, from an engineering standpoint, if we want to call it that, kind of incredibly complex task, it seemed easy at the start because the concept felt so solid in our heads. But then I think as Keri began to articulate the actual elements of the book, we realized how complex it really was. And so a lot of these, in terms of being style experiments, are also material experiments.
Mhm. This one here was the model for the second volvelle. I mean, geez, each part of the book, I think there's probably 5 or 6 models that were made for it. So these were the illustrations. I do all of my illustrations just pencil on paper. That's how they all start. And so these were the figures that we are going to be fixed images on the structure. So we chose the word list together, and which one should be illustrated, and then I tried to pull, and invoke Annie Besant and do these illustrations here. But because of the color palette we were going with, which was that deep blue with the bright pinks and bright blues on top of it, really the only way that would work for that was to have it hot foil stamped, which meant we had to make plates for each of these. So I would start with a pencil drawing and kind of go over it with pen and ink. The one on the left is the original drawing. The one on the right has been scanned and then changed to grayscale and upped the contrast and everything.
I think that I would refer to a lot of times those figures that you see, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and figure 4 is kind of like the iconography of the book. And one thing that was really important to me about it, that I love, is that it creates a lot of friction. We have the focus of the book is something that's kinetic, but then you have these static objects that kind of reside in each of the corners, and they somehow simultaneously feel more important and less important. Something that's called out, that's showed to you, and that's given a single title, something that's not variable. So if we have the beacons in the dark, or the ennui, or the parallax of limerence that you see, those things ended up becoming almost like these touchstones along the way. But the most amazing part, I think, about those touchstones is those words, for the most part, don't appear in the poem or in the book, other than as the figures that you see here, the static figures, the iconography. So we were able to integrate those in a way that played off of the kinetic parts of the book, but we got to keep them kind of static, which is more true to Keri's drawings.
This one has been fully digitized to make plates. So I wanted to keep the hand-drawn feel to things like the banner or the illustrations around. But for the actual engineering of the volvelle, for it to work, the rings in the center had to be perfect. So those were all cleaned up in Illustrator to make plates from. And this was the color proof. And it was real hard with the color, I think, because with things like hot foil stamping, there's so many steps to do before there's no way of really testing it. There's no cheap, easy way to just test it. So these were these digital mock-ups that we had to just trust would look good once all the plates and everything were made and printed.
That was one of the most challenging parts, I think, working at a distance from one another and at a distance from the print shop. So we would send these proofs back and forth to each other long before they were ever cast into dies and before they were foil stamped. And every single time I felt like we noticed something new, we would be like, oh, this part's not going to work. We both know enough about printing, and I would be able to lend anything that I knew about the foil stamping process and say, this figure definitely won't work, or this part isn't going to work. So we had to restructure it a number of different times until we got to a place where we felt comfortable casting the die at all.
So once the structure itself was set, the design was set for the writing component of it, we had to, let me go back for 1 second. But so in the center here, that keystone shape is a window cutout. So all the volvelles behind it, the rings are gonna rotate. So to, I guess, make a writing chart of where the the text is in a go, we had to actually literally trace these little boxes on these rings. So these are the rings removed from that model, and then cleaned up digitally and evenly spaced, so we can get like a actual like a template for Chris to do the writing.
That part was incredibly complex because the measurements change not only for each of them, but sort of the degree of the arc that comprises the little keystone window and everything else. So the measurements were taken, I don't know, dozens of times before I feel like we got it right. And then the purple lines in the image on the left-hand side of the screen are the ones that illustrate what I was describing before, that if you have text in that keystone area and it's rotated around, if you have a slot, it will become visible in the slot. So we had to determine a way that the text would rotate, but then not become visible in the background. So they had to the sort of spaces in between, if we want to call them interstices, had to be wide enough to incorporate the text as well as incorporate the knob that was going to operate them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the spacing ended up something like this, where nothing's quite centered, but the spacing on the top and bottom are give the illusion that they are, to avoid those tracks that are on there. Do you want to talk about this one? How you wrote it?
Yeah. This is where the challenge came in writing the book, is that I wanted the 4 concentric volvelles like I described with 5 lines on each one. But what I also wanted was 5 separate poems that could be broken into pieces, or maybe think of it as 5 separate stanzas of a single poem that could be broken into pieces. And when you broke it into pieces and I replaced the second line or the third line, that they would still operate in a grammatically correct fashion. And the easiest way to do this was with simple verb, kind of like subject, verb, object constructions. But the way that I created variety within that was to have the first line, as you can see, like I'm lingering just beyond apogee as first person. Then you are more air than dust, the second person. And then we move to the third person, we're in a failing. And the last line was so small that they all needed to be single words. So all of those are usually just nouns. In having that first person, second person, and third person construction, it was easier to substitute another line. So on the left-hand side of this screen, what you can see now is a series of permutations that would be possible for something that has 4 volvelles with 5 lines in each. All told, there's 120 different possible permutations of this single poem. So I can rotate the second volvelle to get another line. I can rotate it again. Of course, you could choose the third or the fourth volvelle to rotate in any of those. And again, from the top to the bottom, as we read that stanza of the poem, you can consider it a grammatically correct operation, and it's also a new version of it. So I like to think of it as a book that never really has to be read the same way twice.
So with all of that in mind, and writing, and they're still created in separate pieces. So we're going to see everything in one layer on one side of the book, but really it's made up of 5 movable parts, which all had to be foil stamped. I think there was 8 dies made in total, or 8 plates made in total, and then die cut, and then each of them are independently moving as well. So yeah, layering that not only content wise, but also just to make sure it actually works, because it would be so embarrassing if it didn't.
Yeah, I refer to this as like the scary part. This is where it
Yeah.
felt as though all of the design elements had been settled upon. We had constructed these drawings, then they'd been digitized, and then the poem itself is written. And then when you actually cast the dies and you head to the print shop is when you find out it works or it doesn't work. And that definitely feels like the part of the process that's the most terrifying.
Yep. This is the second volvelle that's in the book. And this one was actually entirely done digitally. So I don't have very many, I guess, origin pictures of it. But these are the two parts. So the one on the left is, or excuse me, the disc on the right will be mounted to the part on the left, and then you'll see that kind of peekaboo of the poems there.
Yeah, I think this part, it's important to explain that the book operating in two separate halves. So we have the left half, and that's what we've been referring to primarily so far, where it has the four concentric volvelles. But on the right half of the book, there's a single volvelle that rotates, and beneath it, there are 9 static poems, as well as 9 little constellation type images. So as that window spins, there are 3 peekaboo holes in it that allow a little bit of color to come through. You can see a single static poem, and then you can also see one of the constellations. These were written as 2 separate poems. So you have the one that corresponds with the volvelles that's interchangeable and kinetic, and then you have this one that's a single poem in 9 stanzas. And technically, they were written in different voices. They were meant to sort of be a call and response. So part of the left-hand side of the book could be read out loud, and then part of the right-hand side could be read out loud. And what's amazing about this configuration is that if you take those 120 different permutations you have on the left-hand side of the book, and then you include the keyhole views, that there's 9 possible ones, you get 1,080 potential views of the book. So the book can be read or seen in 1,080 different ways. This is actually one of my favorite too, and in a moment we'll be able to talk a little bit more about some thematic aspects of the book. But the content from these static poems might be, one of my favorite parts of what we did.
These are the two, actually, I could have just skipped to this slide. These are the two side by side. So these are the digital proofs. And then, of course, they don't look like that when they're being sent out to make plates. So each color layer had to be separated out. And then an additional, the cut lines had to be separated out to make dies. So these are all the bits and pieces to make the dies and the plates. These are the copper plates for the hot foil stamping. They were heavy and huge and expensive. They were about 10 inches by 14 inches. And then these are what the cutting dies look like. So it has these sponges, and then there's this blade in between. So it'll punch out the volvelles. This is Warren Smith, who I think was in La Call. And we hot foil stamped everything on the kludgy. So it works like this. So the plate is, I keep moving my mouse and I realize that you're not seeing it as a pointer. So sorry, there's a heated plate, and then the copper plate is mounted to that. And then in front of here is the foil. So you can see we've already done the pink layer of foil, and we're gonna do the blue right now. So we did that, I don't know, 70 times for each piece. And this is the die cutting here. So once they've been printed, then we run it through here to cut them out. And then after that, it turned out there's a little bit off with the cutting, so after this part they had to be laser cut as well. But these are the final pieces that then needed to be assembled.
From a die
And
cutting perspective, circles or perfect circles are definitely the most challenging. And when you're using a traditional cutting die like that, as opposed to laser cutting, there's always a chance that it's going to be slightly off. So if we were doing a single circle, it probably, would have never even been noticeable. But the moment that you're doing four concentric circles that actually need to move past one another, it was incredibly challenging. So each one of these at this point in time, and Keri knows this all too well, it needs to be hand trimmed to a certain degree if there's little areas that catch or other things. And that helps facilitate the actual motion of the book. So for all of the machinic help that we enlisted, there was still more handiwork to be done.
so each disc then had to be, like Chris said, we laser cut it, and then some of them had to be hand trimmed. And then they're mounted, because they're nestled together, they're all mounted on this thin, I guess, plasticky material called UPO. And because of that, because they're nestled, they're all going to be at different heights. So each one had to be shimmed to make them all level. So there's a lot of, I guess, invisible parts and construction that's going on here. But so they're all shimmed, they're all mounted to a disc so they can have like a central axle point so they can all move without, what's the word, kind of riding up on top of each other when you're moving them. This is the cover with the die cutting. And then the final result.
Yeah, this is an image of the final book, so you can see how it became an actual book. It went from having these two separate components to being bound together at the spine. So it's almost like a clamshell box, except for the one side doesn't fit inside the other. And that's the only way that we could really incorporate all these physical elements that had dimensionality. So as soon as it started coming out towards us on the Z-axis, there had to be a solution for it.
And the last one here is the book in motion. The part I like about the right hand side too is that color shift that happens as the wheel rotates, going from cool to warm colors and back again.
It's like these two small comets kind of chasing each other. I think that's important. Can we go back one slide and I'll talk?
Mm-hmm. Oops, sorry. Of the open book?
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, the open book. Thank you. I did misspeak earlier. There's 4 peekaboo windows on the right-hand side of the book, and the 2 important ones in terms of color shift Keri just mentioned are the comets that sort of streak through the sky on either side, chasing one another, but because they're on opposite sides of the disc, will never really catch one another. I wanted to talk a little bit about our early conversations, whether it was about the epidemic of loneliness or what really led to the content in the book. I like to write about, and I've always liked to write about what I call, the romance of science and the science of romance. So a lot of times what I do is I find these analogies in science that sound really romantic, but when you look into it, there's actual factual science behind it. In this case, I was thinking a lot about relationships because that's what Keri and I were talking about. But then I was thinking about scientific principles like entropy. And then we were also talking a lot about orbits and how orbits have perigee and apogee areas when you're closer together or you're farther apart. And I started to see all these correspondences between not only those vocabulary words, but those analogy scientific facts in the physical world and relationships, which are far more emotional and a lot more nebulous and sometimes more difficult to define. So I started thinking about when you get into a relationship with someone and you come into one another's orbit, and there's these times where you're closer together and times when you're further apart. And then I also started to think about entropy, where energy travels from areas of high concentration to a low concentration, and eventually flattens out. The goal of entropy is sort of like the great flattening. And eventually, what they believe, there are theories that the end of the universe will be the heat death of the universe. There will no longer be any spots that are hot or cold, or any spots that have high energy and low energy. Everything will just flatten out, and there will no longer be a transfer of energy from anywhere to anywhere else. And when I started thinking about that, I started thinking about the way that relationships begin and the way that they end. And a lot of times they don't end catastrophically or traumatically, that sometimes there's just this erosion that takes place. There's this sort of entropy that takes place. There's this great flattening of emotions. All the things that were hot and fast at the beginning become slow and cold at the end. And I think that that's why the poem on the right-hand side sometimes, to me, is more affecting, because it has to do specifically with those notions. It's about how it takes more energy to stay together than to come apart, which is sort of us fighting entropy all the time. There's a part in there about moving away from one another so fast that you'll never be able to reconnect, in the same way that you might think about the expansion of the universe, that all the things in the universe are consistently and constantly getting further apart from one another. So I had all those ideas bouncing around in my head. And one of the most difficult things was to take everything I was just describing and, in terms of creativity within constraint, confine it to this one tiny object, and to write essentially two single poems that probably put together, I don't know, have less than 100 words. There's probably less than 100 words in this whole thing. And I think that that was one of the most challenging things. And that's why I leaned into very simple statements that almost felt like logical propositions. And then the iconography that I described before, and that I would create tension between the kinetic aspects of the book and the static aspects of the book, which would be that iconography of the little illustrations that kind of surround these areas. And in terms of a stylistic push, I think that there was something that Keri and I were both attracted to in the way that you'd make a, you know, clear distinction between astrology and astronomy, or the physics of the universe, and kind of like the really murky world of emotions and whether or not the planets aligning affect how we feel. I think that the way this book looks has a very strange kind of astrological feel to it. But the way that the content or the words play out has a very astronomical feel. And I was looking for that kind of tension too. And I think that in it, self-contained single object, you can see this play between history and this kind of really modern notion and modern palette. You can see the play between astrology and astronomy. You can see the play between two people in relationships and just about everything else. So, and then I think that the last thing that I'll say is I hope that it's evident the interplay between Keri and myself collaborating on this project. We've found that we collaborate with one another probably more easily than we ever have with anyone. It's easy for us to share ideas. It's easy for us to make corrections. It's easy for us to take criticism from one another. And this book is a result of that. This book is a result of two people in each other's orbit, constructing an object together, and sort of fighting against all those forces that might not have made it happen. So. That's all I got.
I was gonna say what a good job we just did, but maybe that's not the time. I'm also looking at this now to just seeing how much we actually distilled. Like it still looks very busy, but the original illustrations or the original sketches had, I think, 6 illustrations on each, which these only have 4. So I think we kind of pared down a lot. And yeah, with collaboration, I think even though we're in the same field or same world, we have a very different and complementary skill set, I think. So it worked out well.
I definitely think that's true as well. I don't know if it'd be a good time for questions. Do you feel like you have anything else to say?
Nope. Just throw this up there.
Yeah.
Oh,
If you're interested in any of the other work that Keri and I do, we're pretty easy to find on Instagram, Facebook, and everything else, or our own personal websites that have galleries of all of our work as well. So feel free to check that out or follow along. I do primarily printing projects, but if you look on my website, it articulates all of my older book arts projects, as well as Please Stay Until Doomsday.
Thank you both. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat and I will relay them to Chris and Keri.
Oh, hey, Sangha Press, what's up? I was just talking to Micah the other day.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm getting ready to head out to Chicago in August. But yeah, I'm still hanging out with him every weekend.
Super cool. So
Yeah, good to
are
see
you
you.
headed out to Chicago permanently?
Sorry?
Are you headed out to Chicago permanently?
Permanently. Yeah, my partner and I will be moving there. So yeah, we're very excited.
Cool. Good luck.
Thank you. Great to see you. Love this work.
You too. Thanks so much.
Any questions right now or comments? Also feel free to turn off your mic and ask.
The greatest presentation in the history of book arts if there's no questions afterwards. It felt like some of the stuff was pretty complex.
the last time I talked about this book, the only question I got was what my sign was,
Oh man.
which was pretty good. It was delightful.
I feel like we should lead with that. We could lead all of our talk.
Or have people guess.
I'm a Scorpio. Like it's just, and they'd be like, of course you are.
Yeah.
I could ask a question. I guess after collaborating and working on such a complex project, like what are some of, for the two of you, like your main takeaways or lessons or like new ways of thinking that you'll like move into future projects with now?
We've already got some stuff in the works for the next book because we worked so well together. And as we were kicking around ideas, I think during this, there was some where we were just like, that's too much. Like we were talking about in that process of paring down. So we set them aside. And then as other ideas have gelled, we've been like, you know what, we need to take that little piece from, that project that didn't make it and turn it into something else. So I definitely won't spoil it, but we're kind of knees deep in another project right now in terms of it conceptually and then figuring out the, what would I call it? Almost like the manufacturing aspects of it. Because again, I think it's going to be like incredibly complex, but unfortunately, this one deals with something that neither of us has expertise in. So to tease it out there a little bit, it's going to be cool. I think it's going to be interesting, but it is not like this. It's going to be a little bit different.
Cool.
Oh, how did we meet? I was in San Antonio as part of my traveling printing project, and I had known about Keri and known about her work, and I just got a hold of her out of the blue. I had like one night when I was there, and I was just like, "Are you around? Do you want to go get dinner? We should just talk about our work." And that was it. we just went and got tacos, and I think within a couple of minutes we realized that we were people who were
Twin flames. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
right, exactly. No, people who were similar in nature, and it made it really easy for us to talk to one another. But nothing too serendipitous, nothing too amazing. Just a simple cold call from me to kind of see what she was up to. Oh, Alexandra has a question.
Yeah, the question is, why did you choose traditional cutting over the laser cutting initially?
I think it was a cost thing, and I thought they would. I guess my definition of what a perfect circle was, it didn't really work. It would, like Chris said, it would have worked if it was just one circle. That would have been fine. But because they all rely on each other to be perfect, it just didn't work. I should have done laser cutting to start, but it was I had easier access and it was cheaper to do die cutting.
Yeah, I think that like I would defend Keri here, even though my initial notion was to have all the pieces laser cut.
You did tell me that. Yeah.
The idea later, though, really started to rely on, I think, efficiency. So she was in the print shop, she was doing the foil stamping. If you got the dies for the cutting, it could all be done at the same time on the Klugis. So having access to that equipment, I think, was really maybe one of the factors too, you know, as opposed to taking all the pieces home, crossing your fingers, and then going somewhere to laser cut them. So it streamlined the process, but at the end of the day, it did prove to be a greater challenge than it should have been. I think that if we were to do something like this in the future that requires that kind of surgical precision, that we would probably laser cut all of the aspects of the book, and then hopefully the assembly would go a little bit easier.
Well, and the die cutting did work for just not for the rings. For the larger disc, it worked, and then for the cover plate, it worked. But just those rings were the ones that they needed to be more accurate. Our tolerance was, yeah, didn't work for that.
Anything else?
Okay, I think people, as someone said, are just in awe of this project.
It was a lot too. Like, I mean, we started it in well, I guess one thing we didn't, it was made, we had a deadline. We had a hard deadline because it was in an exhibition at UC Berkeley. So
and we wanted it for the Codex book fair,
and for Codex,
which
right.
was February of this year. And we'd started conceptualizing it, what, in September or October?
No, it was much earlier. We were already printing by November. So no, it was, I mean, we started in the summer.
Yeah.
But it was I mean, it was still like just this very quick turnaround. I mean, we started in the summer and then you know, printing and assembling in November, December to have it ready. Because it needed to be done by December for the show.
Got it. Elizabeth had a question about how we financed the project.
Oh, I'm so embarrassed to say. I put it on my credit card for all the I'm still paying for this project.
Yeah. It was one of those ones where if the book is successful, which it has been, even at Codex, their response was really good, that it will pay for itself and more. But I think that getting over that hump, you know, that was something that we were looking towards and kind of dreading to a certain degree. I mean, neither one of us are salesmen per se, but or salespeople. But at the same time, it was just kind of like we knew essentially we'd have to sell 15 or 20 books before we even broke even, and then after that, we'd be in halfway decent shape.
Right. Well, and I think the cost of the project, I don't want to say it's less, but it's really just the raw materials because everything is actually being made in-house. Like I do all the binding myself, like the assembly, like the production part of it myself. I worked with a printer I knew to do the foil stamping and the die cutting. Some of it was done with trade, like the laser cutting. I traded some stuff for that. So like those were all things that helped as well. Nothing was really outsourced necessarily, except for the getting the plates made.
I do think it's important to point out as much risk as was taken on and as much labor as is involved, or like you were just saying that you trade occasionally, that some of this is really relies on connections that we have in this space, whether it's with people, whether it's with print shops and other things. So big thanks to all the people that helped us along the way to make this a reality, because I think after being in the community as long as you and I have been, we can reach out to people and say, I'm stuck, or I have this, or I'd like to do this, and they're willing to help. So that makes it kind of like it took a village to a certain degree to kind of get all these pieces out there. Um, There's a couple more questions. Alexandra asked if we would change anything about the final product, if we could.
That is a good question. I don't think so, other than laser cutting it from the beginning. I mean, there's a few things just in retrospect like would have made the production a bit smoother, but I'm really happy with the finished outcome. There's a few issues that were out of our control, like I think we could have made the edition larger, but there was just a materials issue as well.
That's true. I do agree with you, though. This is one of the projects that feels really good to me in the way that the picture I had of it in my head when I was laying in bed at night is almost identical to the object that was constructed in the world. And just based on the way I work personally as an artist and a printer, those are the ones I like. I'm not a big fan of when things spiral out and become something different. I often have a notion of what the finished object will look like before the project even starts. And I think for Keri and I, we rode a fine line between letting this become what it wanted to become and collaborating really well. But then at the end of the day, I don't know, it really sort of still looks like what I imagined it would look like, which is fantastic. And Elizabeth also asked if it was available to college libraries, which it is. We're doing ordering right now, and we're kind of waiting for the fiscal year to roll over. But we've been in contact with a number of people, and I think about a third or more of the edition is already gone. So
I think almost half, actually. But yeah.
Oh yeah, probably close to half now. You're right, because I think there's going to be 60 total. Is that what we're shooting for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
60.
So feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that. We're both very easy to get a hold of.
Are there any more questions? Last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you so much, Keri and Chris. This talk will be posted on CBAA's channel, and then our next BAS Book Art Series talk will be Tuesday, June 25th at 6 p.m. Central Time with Maria Carolina Ceballos. So please join us for that. And again, please register for the meeting if you have not already done so and want to attend.
Thanks so much for moderating and
Yes,
setting this up. I really appreciate it and facilitating everything. And thanks to everybody who spent the evening with us. I know you can do anything that you want on a Thursday evening, but I appreciate your hour.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Keri and Chris.
Take care.
I'm gonna go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you, everyone.